Good evening. My name is David Bubis, Director of Philanthropy at Public Counsel. Welcome to our very first hour of Justice panel discussions, where we'll be exploring a variety of legal and social issues and challenges facing our community and country. Thank you all for joining us tonight, especially those of you who are Dodger fans. Thank goodness for recording devices, and please do not give any score away in the chat room tonight. Before I introduce tonight's topic and panel, I want to thank and acknowledge the co-sponsors of our series, the Beverly Hills Bar Association, the Daily Journal, the LA chapter of the Federal Bar Association, the LA County Bar Association, and the Mexican American Bar Association. We appreciate your support and for your assistance in getting the word out about our panel discussions. I also want to acknowledge and thank our immediate past chair of our board, Phil Cook, for his vision and leadership in making this series a reality. As you may be aware, Public Counsel is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Public Counsel is the largest pro bono law firm in the nation. We work with major law firms and corporations to change people's futures. Our 130 staff made up of attorneys, social workers, and support staff, along with 5,000 volunteer lawyers, law students, and others, assist over 30,000 children, youth, families, and community organizations each year. Our activities are far-ranging and impact a wide spectrum of people who live at or below the poverty level. Tonight, we will focus on one issue that we work on intently every day: the mass homelessness population in LA County and beyond. Our discussion tonight is entitled, "Will COVID-19 Make Our Homelessness Crisis Explode?" With the end of the federal and local moratoria, a looming avalanche of evictions and foreclosures threaten our most vulnerable neighbors. What is the scope of this problem, especially in light of COVID, and what should we know about how this issue is and will change in the near future? We've assembled a well-informed and respected panel tonight to explore the topic. It's my pleasure to introduce them now, along with our moderator. Greg Bonnet is a staff attorney in Public Counsel's Community Development Project. In addition to providing transactional support to low-income entrepreneurs and nonprofits, the Community Development Project partners with community-based coalitions to promote the development and preservation of affordable and supportive housing, preserve existing rent-stabilized housing, strengthen tenant protection laws, and advocate for equitable development policies that advance racial and economic justice and build power in low-income communities and communities of color. Recently, Greg has worked with community groups and tenants advocating for stronger renter protections in LA County, helping to usher in the largest expansion of local rent stabilization laws in California in decades, and strengthen protections for tenants during the COVID-19 pandemic. Gary Blasey is professor of law emeritus at UCLA School of Law. He joined the faculty of law school in 1991 after working as an advocate and attorney for people in poverty for 20 years. Early in his career, Blasey specialized in the representation of low-income tenants and homeowners. He co-founded the Eviction Defense Center at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. When mass homelessness came to LA in 1983, his primary work began to focus on working with and representing unhoused people. For 8 years, he directed LAFLA's Homelessness Litigation Project, where he coordinated large-scale litigation on behalf of indigent and homeless people in LA County. Professor Blasey took emeritus status in 2012, but continues to do research relevant to public policy, most recently regarding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on unemployment, evictions, and homelessness. Savannah Naguib is a supervising staff attorney in Public Counsel's Homelessness Prevention Law Project. Her team represents people experiencing homelessness and people at imminent risk of homelessness with a wide range of legal needs, helping to remove barriers to safe, stable, secure housing. Prior to joining Public Counsel, she worked as a prisoner's rights litigator, a housing attorney, a public defender, a criminal appellate lawyer, and a public interest career counselor for law students. Fundamentally, as she described herself, she's an anti-poverty lawyer working to address the harms caused by systemic racism and wealth inequality in many different contexts. She's practiced in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and LA. Molly Reisman is the Housing and Homelessness Deputy at the Office of LA County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl. Molly Reisman works to create systems change and public policy that supports solutions to homelessness and expands the supply of affordable housing in the 3rd District and throughout LA County. Prior to joining Supervisor Kuehl's office, Ms. Reisman served as the LA Director for CSH, a community development finance institution dedicated to expanding housing solutions to reduce homelessness. She earned her master's degree in urban planning from the University of California, LA, and is a proud alumnus of California State University of Los Angeles, where she earned her bachelor's degree. And finally, if she's with us, Erica Smith will moderate tonight. She's a columnist for the LA Times, writing about the diversity of people and places across California. She joined the Times in 2018 as an assistant editor and helped expand coverage of the state's housing and homelessness crisis. She previously worked at Sacramento Bee, where she was columnist and editorial board member covering housing, homelessness, and social justice issues. Before the Bee, Smith wrote for the Indianapolis Star and Akron Beacon Journal. She's a recipient of the Sigma Delta Chi Award for column writing, graduate of Ohio University and a native of the long-suffering sports town of Cleveland. A quick word about our format tonight. Erica will be moderating our discussion for about 40 to 45 minutes. At about 6:45 or so, we'll give you all an opportunity to ask the panelists questions via the chat function on YouTube until we end at 7 p.m. Please do not wait until 6:45 to ask questions. Go ahead and write them in as we go along. I'll be monitoring them and passing along as many questions as possible to Erica. Thank you all again for being here. And without further ado, I pass the baton off to Erica. Erica, are you here?
I am here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for the great introduction, and thanks to our panel for being here. I want to start off just talking a little bit, just so we're all on the same page and talking about housing and homelessness. This one's to Molly and Silvana. Can you both just kind of give kind of an idea of the scope of the problem here in LA County, both in terms of numbers and also in terms of impact into kind of our quality of life? I don't know who wants to start.
Silvana, do you want me to start and I'll give some numbers and then you can fill in the details? Great. So first off, I just want to say it's an honor to be here. I'm a huge fan of public counsel, and the work I do would not be possible without folks like Greg and Silvana and all of the great folks at public counsel who help us in government figure out how to tackle really complicated problems, particularly really complicated legal problems that we come up against all the time. So in just sort of trying to set the stage around homelessness, first off, I just want to say that to understand what changed in Los Angeles, because I know that this is something that I really had to look into myself. And I know a lot of people ask me this question about, like, why did we start seeing an incredible inflow of people on the sidewalks right around 2014 and 2015? That's what our homeless counts started to show. Is right around that time, we saw this dramatic increase in homelessness, which was very bizarre because we were actually housing more people than we'd ever housed at that time. And so we knew something was going very wrong in Los Angeles. And when we look back now, what we understand changed was the relationship between housing and incomes. Rents have gone up 45% since the year 2000, and incomes have gone up 11%. So as the relationship between rents and incomes became so sort of out of whack, it caused a lot of people to no longer be able to afford housing. We didn't have more people move here. We didn't have an increase in mental health issues. We didn't have an increase in substance abuse issues. The criminal justice reforms had no impact on homelessness. None of those factors that people talk about changed. What really changed was the relationship between income and rents. And so that's what started to drive the explosion on our streets. And just to put it into perspective, to help people sort of understand how this works. So if you look at the beginning of 2019, we started 2019 with roughly 59,000 people experiencing homelessness in LA County. Over the course of those 12 months of 2019, what we know is that another 83,000 people touched our homeless system. That's actually probably an undercount of inflow because there's a lot of people who become homeless and never touch our homeless system. So it was probably closer to somewhere between 150 to 200,000 people who actually experienced homelessness over the course of those 12 months. But we know about the 83,000 people that touched our homeless system. During those 12 months, we housed 23,000 people. So the homeless system assisted 23,000 people to get into permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, or we just gave them funding to just help them get into any sort of normal housing. Sometimes that's reuniting with families. Sometimes it's getting a market rate apartment. We had another 53,000 people who exited homelessness without any assistance. They touched the homeless system, but they were able to get out of homelessness on their own. But we ended the year with 63,000 because the inflow was so much greater than the people that we helped exit homelessness. We still saw an increase in homelessness despite the historic investments that are happening in LA County. I'm very proud to live in a county where we voted for Measure H and we supported Proposition Triple H, and the taxpayers have really stepped up to address homelessness. And even with those historic investments that are having a tremendous impact, we've doubled the number of people we house every year. It still isn't enough to deal with the fact that rents are going up so much faster than incomes.
So I want to provide a little bit of kind of a personal view on the homelessness crisis. Thank you, Molly, for giving us that kind of overview about what's been happening in the county over the last decade. The team that I supervise at Public Counsel actually receives funding through Measure H from the county through something called the Lawyers Preventing and Ending Homelessness Project. And one of the things we do is try to prevent people from entering homelessness. Those usually because people are in the process of being evicted or they're in danger, they're about to have an eviction filed against them, they're behind on their rent. And what we are seeing echoes exactly what Molly is talking about, which is that these are the folks that have been identified by the homeless services system as being at most risk of becoming homeless. And by and large, it's folks who they can't afford to pay their rent, even though they have some type of income, or they're on public benefits, or they're disabled and they receive Social Security, disability, or supplemental security income. And the fact of the matter is that these folks, they can't afford to live in Los Angeles because of the rising cost of rent. And so when we are looking at trying to assist them to find another place or resolve their dispute with their landlord, and this was all before the pandemic, there's not really good solution, because they can't afford to live in their even their rent controlled apartment, or they have an apartment that's relatively affordable. And we're talking to these clients and they're saying, I can't afford this. Every time something happens, my kid has to go to the dentist or my car breaks down. I can't pay my rent because the rent burden is so high for so many families in Los Angeles County. And so, when these folks fall behind on their rent, there's really not any way to catch up. And so they end up, doubling up with other families, sleeping in their car. And it's been surprising to me as an attorney and as a legal service provider, because I was thinking, if these folks just had access to lawyers, we could help them prevent homelessness. And we can't. I mean, sometimes we do, but there are definitely plenty of cases where we do not succeed in preventing homelessness, despite the fact that these folks are connected to homeless services providers and they're connected to us as well. But the math just doesn't add up in Los Angeles. And so what I'm concerned about in the context of COVID-19 is that, you already have a system that is the situation that's so precarious for so many people from a financial perspective. And that precarity has just exploded in the context of the pandemic.
Got it. Yeah, actually, I kind of want to follow up on that. And this is to the panel in general. How has the pandemic exacerbated what you and Molly just described, both in terms of the people who were already on the street and the people who were kind of on that bubble on the verge of becoming homeless?
I can answer that if you like. The main thing that the COVID epidemic has done is intensify everything that Molly and Silvana were talking about by orders of magnitude. And it's had dramatically different effects on different segments of the population, with most of the impact falling on lower income people, people of color, people with lower educational ranks. So the people who already had trouble with employment have tremendous trouble now. So if you look both at the medical consequences, which, for example, African Americans are 3 times as likely to die as European Americans in LA County, and you look at unemployment rates and so on, it's made everything much, much worse. But primarily what it's done is take that inability to pay that rent in a mismatch situation and caused hundreds of thousands of people to be unable to pay the rent who were just hanging by. And I did a study in May that estimated about 365,000 households were at high risk of eviction. I didn't know at the time the census was actually conducting a study during the same exact period. They estimated about 400,000 households were at high risk. The Aspen Institute has estimated that about 600,000 people in LA County are at high risk of eviction. And what's stopped most of the evictions so far is the judiciary. Those things have been, eviction cases have been frozen because in order to file an eviction case and serve it, you have to get a summons from the court. And the court stopped issuing summons, but they're going to start again on November the 6th. So there is this big overhang of people who can't pay the rent, are behind on the rent, and will face a flood of evictions. So we're about to see a lot more people evicted. People say that the moratoriums and so on will help, but and they will help some people, but they won't help anyone who can't get a lawyer to help them respond to the eviction case when it comes. Unrepresented tenants never win. 0% of unrepresented tenants win. Either they default immediately or they eventually lose at trial, or they settle for no more than they could have gotten had they lost at trial. So the distribution of the impact of COVID has been exactly the same as you would expect, both in terms of neighborhoods and populations. It's intensified inequality dramatically, and it's made our problem much worse than anything that we have anticipated. And we're not ready for that avalanche.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing, if I can, just to jump in, because it's really important, we already had a horrible issue with racial disparities in terms of who experiences homelessness. So before COVID ever hit, only 8% of LA County's population is African American, but 34% of people who experience homelessness are African American. And we know that this is because of job discrimination, housing discrimination, the impact of criminal justice, racial disparities, because it's much harder to get an apartment if you have a criminal conviction on your record. Wealth inequality, landlords run credit checks. I mean, we know all the reasons why these racial disparities were so bad in homelessness. It's similarly terrible for the Native American population. But with COVID, the disparities are only going to get so much worse, because we know COVID is similarly hitting the Black and Brown community in a really intense way. And that is going to be really, really heartbreaking to see in the homeless system. Got to figure out a way to help people stay in their homes, because once people hit the streets, the trauma that they experiencing homelessness is so tremendous and very, very hard to come back from. And lots of people do get out of homelessness and get their lives back on track, but not without significant experience of trauma. So it is very concerning, the way racial disparities are being exacerbated by the pandemic.
Greg, did you want to chime in with a few things? And before you speak, I wanted to remind people to submit questions when they have them. So make it easier for me in about 25 minutes or so. But Greg, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that sort of in addition to this sort of a risk of a huge uptick in evictions once the protections expire, that's one way it could play out, but it also could play out in just sort of this slow burn that goes on month after month after month, and even years, where parts of the economy recover fine and people get back to work, and other segments have several months worth of income as debt that they owe their landlords, extra barriers to finding employment, and that just holds them back from from getting a job. If they've got a judgment against them, that could come up on a background check. If they do get a job, they could be facing wage garnishment, making it even harder to afford an apartment. So there's real concern that there could be some have called it a tsunami of evictions, and I think that's a a real risk. But almost as scary as this just potentially years long attrition of lower income people into homelessness and unable to recover from the pandemic.
So the state and local governments have put up a number of programs as COVID started to ramp up and cases started to ramp up. Project Room Key among them, which is getting the most vulnerable homeless people off the street into hotel rooms. The city put up a number of congregate shelters and rec centers. How are these programs faring so far from what, and this could be to anybody, as far as what you're seeing, and how, whether it's a tsunami or kind of this slow drip over time, what are we going to need both locally and from the state and perhaps federally to kind of to ease this and to kind of reverse that trend?
I don't think there's any way that we can actually deal with the problem without dealing on a massive scale with the problems of income. There is no supply of housing that could conceivably come online that would absorb this. And all of our thinking recently in the past decade or so has been this is a housing supply problem. It's not, it's an income problem. There are close to 100,000 people whose only income is county welfare, general relief, which pays $221 a month. There's no world in which there will be housing affordable for anything close to that. And then there's a much larger group of people whose income is zero. So unless we deal with that problem, I don't think there's any solution other than basically something akin to refugee camps. And at UCLA, we've done studies of a couple of mild improvements on refugee camps in case the government has to go in that direction, which I think they're probably going to have to. Long term, just to follow up on something that Greg said, the one thing the state did in the legislature was basically didn't forgive any rent, but it allowed the conversion of rent debt to consumer debt. There are going to be billions of dollars of debt hanging over the heads of working class people in LA County for years and years and years. And that's going to make it even harder for them to get back. When they do have an income, they're going to be so far in debt, they're going to be using all that income just to stay alive.
I want to touch on what Gary's talking about the consumer debt, because this is something that that our team and eviction defense lawyers throughout LA County has really been wrestling with, which is what is going to happen to these cases. Let's say you're the best case scenario. The rent you owe is only from the period for which the protections are the strongest. That's March to August of 2020. You can't be evicted for not having paid your rent. You managed to get yourself a lawyer and complete all the required documents, and everything went right. You still have this debt hanging over your head. Let's say they go to small claims court and you do in fact owe it. You didn't pay. It's converted to consumer debt. You now have a judgment against you. So thinking about what's going to happen to those folks, right? Which is that it's not like consumer debt is just a nullity, right? It can be collected on, wages can be garnished, and it's, I think, going to be public information that landlords are going to have access to. And so we're going to see an exacerbation of what we already see, which is that the housing market is very tight because of capitalism, right? Supply and demand, right? There's not a lot of housing. Landlords are competing for the best tenants. And if you have a checkered credit history, if you have an eviction on your record, either from before the pandemic or currently, it's going to be hard for you to get an apartment. And also that, there's this recent report that came out of the Luskin Center from Ananya Roy and others that talks about how, the crisis is actually a wealth opportunity for a lot of folks, because there's going to be a dip, right? And people are going to be buying housing, and then, the market's going to improve. And we're going to see that rents are going to be going up in the future as Los Angeles County recovers from this crisis. And in that situation, it's going to be even more difficult for these people who have debt from the pandemic to access housing. And that's one thing that we've really seen even before the pandemic is you might have people that have income, have a steady job, but they still can't obtain housing. I mean, I have clients that have Section 8 vouchers that can't find a landlord that will let them lose their voucher. They're sitting in a homeless shelter with a Section 8 voucher. And so this is just going to be another kind of scarlet letter on these clients, or why I think of them as clients, but working people, low income people in Los Angeles, where it's going to make it very difficult for them to obtain stable housing in the future if they decide they want to move, or something breaks bad.
One thing I do want to emphasize, though, is this is not inevitable, because I think, we can present the facts in a way where it feels like this is so overwhelming and nothing can be done and we're just facing this horrible situation. But, in most of the Western world, there isn't homelessness the way we experience it in the United States. Like, homelessness is a very unique problem in the United States because we ration housing assistance. In most of the Western world, housing assistance programs are an entitlement, which means if you qualify based on your income, the folks that Gary was talking about, the folks who are on general relief, the folks who have zero income, in most of the Western world, if you're below a certain level of income, you get rental assistance. We are the crazy country who decided it was better to ration our housing assistance, and only 1 in 4 people in the United States who qualify for Section 8 or any kind of housing assistance get it. That's crazy. It makes no sense. Our streets would look very differently if we simply had our housing assistance as an entitlement instead of the crazy way we do it with these rationed programs. Not that it solves the problem overnight. I mean, really what you want to get to is to be a country where you have a right to housing, where you're providing housing assistance and you're providing an adequate supply of affordable housing. That's where you really start to see the transformative system like they have in Finland and some other countries in Europe. But I just want to make it clear, this isn't inevitable. This is the way through public policy we set up our systems.
So are you I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, so are you heartened by, there's a number of cities, Compton is the one that comes to mind off the top of my head, but in Stockton, following Stockton, but a number of, cities that are in California and nationally that are trying universal basic income experiments or some version of that, which kind of gets at some of what you're talking about. Is that heartening to you in the idea of like solving this in a different way? And how much political will would you say there is for doing that? And I imagine it's a very different conversation in California than it is in, Iowa, but it's got to be, what are you seeing from your perspective on that?
Well, I'll just start, but then I want others to jump in, but I'll just say I'm a gigantic fan of universal basic income programs. I think they're incredibly promising. We also just saw a study out of Vancouver where they tried just giving people experiencing homelessness $7,500, which is much cheaper than a shelter stay. And most people got out of homelessness. It's amazing. When you have the money to afford rent, you will not be homeless. So I think that's really promising. But the one thing I want to caution folks is at the local level, it's very hard to do these programs because we don't have the resources. The reason, the Section 8 program is a federal program. We cannot, at the local level, we'll never have enough tax revenue to provide rental assistance at a level where it could be an entitlement. So it's both that we need the promising models, but we also need the resources. And really, when you have inequality this great, the federal government has to play a role, which is the other reason why we've made these historic investments in Los Angeles and people haven't seen that much difference on the streets, is because we're doing this alone with local resources. And it's never going to be enough unless the federal government steps up.
I would just amplify that and say that we could end homelessness in America very quickly if the Fed allocated anywhere near the amount of money that it allocated to prop up the stock market, to prop up the housing market and the lives of working people. And so almost everything that you see on the streets of Los Angeles depends on what a Biden, hopefully, administration will actually do and how progressive it will be, and the role of the Fed in generating enough money to make that possible. But as much as I fight with the county about spending more money on things, when you look at the scale of the problem, there's no local solution that because of the way the public finance system works and where the money originates. So if we don't get it from the Fed and the federal government, then we won't see much change.
Well, how would that, just out of curiosity, I mean, how would that actually solve the problem? And I get the money factor, but there is a legit like number of housing units factor, mismatched to people in LA County and in California in general. So even if money was available, it's not like tomorrow you can snap your fingers and there be an apartment for every single person who's on the street, unless I'm misreading the numbers.
But with project-based Section 8, we can incentivize developers to build that housing. If developers know that they have an adequate operating stream of funding, they will build the housing. That is our most precious resource that developers fight over in incredibly competitive processes, is to get project-based Section 8. So just that one resource alone will spur people to put in private investment to build housing.
But that would take time though, as well though, right? Because housing takes a long time
absolutely.
to build. Yeah.
Housing takes time, but we're 40 years into a homeless crisis. Would we like to solve it in 5 years, building some housing? And also, I mean, people will find housing in the private market with tenant-based vouchers as well. I mean, with the right resources, this really could transform pretty quickly.
And there's nothing to say that the current way of financing and constructing housing is the only way to do it. There are many ways to produce livable housing relatively quickly that are used in lots of other places. We just don't do it because we're still using 19th century technology for the most part in residential construction. And because we're building 2,000 square foot apartments and we aren't building any 300 or 400 square foot apartments.
Greg, you were going to add something.
Yeah, I guess I was just gonna point out that even in the middle of this pandemic, where a lot of community groups, a lot of folks in government are thinking about, okay, how do we just keep people housed? How do we keep people fed? I mean, a lot of it is just like meet those basic needs. At the same time, there is long-term planning happening right now. The city and the county are updating their housing elements. Many of the community plans, like the downtown Los Angeles community plan, all the zoning for downtown LA is being updated right now. And a big part of those updates are producing more housing. But, and I think we all know that just building housing alone is not going to be enough. That housing needs to be affordable. There needs to be policies in place to make sure that new construction doesn't displace existing tenants. So I think there is a very, very big role for local government and for community groups engaging with local government to make sure that we are building housing. We're making sure that that new housing includes a significant amount of affordable housing, and that there are strong protections in place so that we don't lose some of the affordable housing that we've got. All of that would work very well and complement a significant influx of federal money. Like the dream would be we can do those two things and then it's problem solved. But I'm just saying that I think there's a lot that local government can do too around these planning efforts.
Got it. How do you all feel about Project Home Key, which is that next step program after Project Room Key of converting some of these hotels that have been used into, I guess, affordable housing or apartments? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll jump in there just because the county is one of the main participants in Project Home Key. So at the county level, we're purchasing just over 800 hotel rooms. The cities, I forget the exact number, whether the cities had 900 or 1,000 hotel rooms that they're purchasing. We have some individual cities in the county also purchasing hotel rooms, which I think is great. I mean, it's taking advantage of the federal stimulus dollars from the CARES Act that the state and the county and the city all received, quickly moving in to secure land, which is the best way to ensure long-term affordability is when we actually control the land. When we have a tenant-based Section 8 voucher, we're just giving that money to a private landlord who can make that apartment unaffordable for the next person who comes in. When we control the land, we can really create long-term affordability. So from a long-term perspective, it's great that we're securing these units. We estimate that there are 15,000 COVID vulnerable people experiencing homelessness, and this is all a response to COVID. This is supposed to be how to get people who are most at risk of getting COVID to not get the virus because of how dangerous it is for people experiencing homelessness because of their underlying health conditions. So Project Home Key is great. It is nothing near the scale that we need to serve those 15,000 people. But it's great, it's something.
Mm-hmm. What other laws that are out there? I mean, and there's lots of programs for homelessness and lots of programs for rent relief, but there's not as many laws on the books right now to do that. And I'm thinking of coming up in the election, Prop 21 for rent control. Do you have thoughts on what laws we need in addition to the funding, whether it's laws to require more funding or just laws that increase protections for renters or for homeless people?
Well, I want to join in and say my number one request would be a codified right to counsel in evictions in terms of a law that I wish was on the books. I think, like Gary said, there's zero chance of tenants succeeding in eviction court without an attorney. Sometimes they don't succeed even with an attorney, but they fare much, much better with access to counsel. And to stand in eviction court and watch what happens to unrepresented tenants in LA County, it's stomach turning, honestly, because the way that the system is set up, they have no advantages whatsoever. The landlord's attorneys are extremely familiar with the laws. They're appearing in court every day in front of the same judges. And the judges, because it's a civil case, the judges sort of don't have this same obligation to kind of inquire into the specifics of the case. So they're kind of treating it like a normal civil case, like, okay, what do you say? Okay, what do you say? And tenants are not in a position to advocate for themselves effectively, even before the pandemic, because the law is incredibly technical. And there's a lot of little moving parts, and that's only increased during the pandemic because now we have city protections, county protections, there's a state law, there's a CDC moratorium. And so when I'm thinking about how our tenants going to navigate a potential eviction, I foresee that there are a lot of people who are covered by potential moratoriums or other protections who are going to be evicted anyway, because they're not able to successfully understand or articulate that the protections apply to them, and there's nobody else who's kind of looking into it if they don't have access to counsel. So that would be my number one wish.
Greg, Molly, thoughts?
Well, I'll just say quickly, Supervisor Kuehl and myself were big supporters of Prop 21. I think rent stabilization and rent control are really critically important to protecting tenants and keeping them in their homes. I think, Prop 21 is trying to overturn this ridiculous state law, Costa-Hawkins, that is truly one of the most draconian, racist, horrible laws that we have on the books in California, which says local jurisdictions cannot enact protections for tenants, which is ridiculous. Because it should be up to each jurisdiction how they want to try and protect their tenants. And I'm going to set Greg up because the county would not have enacted our local rent stabilization ordinance, which we were deeply prevented from going as far as we want to go because of Costa-Hawkins, but we wouldn't have even gotten the protections we have if it wasn't for the work of Greg and public counsel and an amazing coalition of advocates that worked tirelessly for years to get rent stabilization in the unincorporated areas of the county where we had zero tenant protections.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. And I mean, I think that that was an example of a huge expansion of rent control when the county adopted its rent stabilization ordinance. Hundreds of thousands of tens to hundreds of thousands of households were protected and were far more stable in their housing. But it also did illustrate the limitations that Costa-Hawkins creates. There are a lot of people living in single-family homes that don't have the benefit of the rent stabilization. Prop 21 would free up the county to cover some of those folks. But I just want to sort of build on that and suggest that some of these emergency protections that have been put in place during the pandemic, I optimistically, hoping that they'll sort of shift our thinking about how tenant protections can work and open us up to ideas about things that previously would not have seemed possible. During the pandemic, it was the first time to my knowledge, at least in recent history, where we had a protection that says, even if you didn't pay your rent, you can't be evicted. That is sort of a paradigm shift. And I would hope that once the pandemic is over, that we keep a piece of that. It's not written in stone somewhere that someone who's been paying their rent month after month after month and comes up short 1 month, that person's housing should be at stake just because they were short 1 month. I think I'm hoping that this pandemic will sort of broaden our horizon to think about, okay, what is a world of protections that we could give people to make them more secure in their housing, and really think creatively about what's there and go beyond. So I think tenant protections are a big piece. I think they are really effective at preventing people from entering homelessness. It's obviously one piece of a much bigger response, and a right to counsel. Make any law in the book is more powerful if you have an attorney to actually interpret and advocate under that law. But I'm really hoping that we can continue to push the envelope on tenant protections.
Which is a perfect segue. And I was going to ask Gary the last question. And again, if you guys have any questions out there, please feel free to submit them, and I already have a few I'm going to ask after this, but kind of what should people be looking for going forward? I mean, you mentioned about tenant protections maybe being codified into law in some way, shape, or form, but given the political pressures, particularly from landlord groups and just the business of the status quo, kind of what are we going to be seeing as far as for tenants and as far as for homeless people as over the next few months, particularly if the virus continues to spike again and we have another fall bump up in cases?
Right. Well, it's really scary. In the short run, we should be planning for a big increase in people becoming homeless. Not everybody who gets evicted becomes homeless, but the main reason that people who are evicted don't become homeless is because they have social networks that can help them. But social networks are like insurance. They assume that not everybody in the network is going to be hit at the same time. But poor people have poor social networks, and those social networks are devastated by COVID. So the percentage of people who are getting evicted and the percentage of those people who are families with kids is going to be enormous. And we don't have that much time. I think it's probably not going to be the tsunami that we predicted. It's going to be a series of really big waves. But we're soon going to see a lot of people that we've never seen before in places that we've never seen families. And if we don't do something on an emergency basis to help those folks, I think it could get very grim. I also think that we should be doing everything we can in California to get more federal help building a movement with progressive states around the country to push a Biden administration to really begin to deal with the long-term problem that Molly identified, which is that it shouldn't depend on luck as to whether you can survive or not. A right to survive includes a right to housing. And until we have something like that, which can only be secured if there's enough money to pay people who have the obligation to provide that housing, then we're not going to get there. And so I agree with Greg also. I think that this could be a shock to the way that we think about things, how we frame this issue. And in some ways, it's an opportunity to sort of get unstuck from where we've been for so many years, just sort of complaining about the imbalance between supply and demand and the inadequacy of the supply, and do something in a direction that'll take us off this path we've been on for 40 years, which is not getting any better and is about to fall off a cliff potentially.
I'm going to go to a couple of questions from people who are watching. And I apologize in advance for mispronouncing anybody's name. There's a question from Wanis Naguib, who said, what is happening at the state level to combat this crisis? So is that your brother? He smiled. Does anybody want to take that one?
I don't know if you want to take that one, Greg.
Maybe I'll.
You want to start, Greg? Okay.
Go ahead. Go.
I'll just start. So Project Home Key is a state program. Those are primarily state resources. So that's one of the responses. But I think the more important response was AB 3088, which was the bill that David Chu introduced in the Assembly and that passed, that worked to try and protect tenants until the end of January. So it's important to say 3088 was really important because it did give us some protections so that tenants are not being evicted. But that bill expires, or its protections expire in January, and we don't know what happens after January. I mean, in LA County, there's a deep commitment to trying to protect tenants with local ordinances, but really we need statewide protections.
The other thing that happened was the Judicial Council of California basically put a pause on all evictions. The Judicial Council is a body of judges that sort of governs how the courts in California run. And it was the single most important thing, in my view, that has happened thus far during the pandemic, that basically summons could not be issued in eviction cases for months and months. And that kind of allowed everyone to sort of take stock. There was time for the legislature to pass AB 3088. You know, there were things happening at the local level. But basically, in the absence of sort of like a public health reason that someone needed to be evicted, no evictions could go forward. But those protections are now over. So that's why they are starting again, evictions.
Well, speaking of AB 3088, Josh had a question. It said, is there room to legislate that this AB 3088 consumer debt not have the usual 10% interest rate applied to it like other money judgments? Any movement on this front?
I'm not aware of any movement along that front. It's basically, thus far, just converted it from rent for which you could be evicted for non-payment to consumer debt for which you could not be evicted. But the debt is still there. It's ordinary debt, just like if you owed a private school that ripped you off, or any other business that you owed money to. And they have all the tools to get that money out of you that the law has built over many, many decades to extract money from poor people and give it to the people they owe money to.
Is there any indication, this is my own question, about what the legislature might do when they, in the next session as far as addressing some of this problem? It seemed they were kind of kicking the can down the road, hoping the feds would do something. Now we're kind of, everybody's, at least in the Newsom administration, is hoping that there's a Biden victory, which would potentially provide more money. But is there any sense of what the options are for the legislature? Or what the preferred option is, maybe?
We definitely need tenant protections. Like, we can try and do things with programs, but I try as much as possible to let people know we will not end homelessness with programs, because when you do a program, you're rationing assistance, and it doesn't work. I mean, it's helpful for the lucky few who get that assistance, but what we really need is legal protections and entitlement programs. So we are desperately going to need some sort of follow-up to 3088. There's going to have to be statewide tenant protections. And I'll just say, I mean, I think there's tremendous pressure on state legislators from the real estate industry, from apartment associations. I mean, the state legislators who are trying to lead this work are being fought tooth and nail by the industry that doesn't want any protections.
If rent control, if Prop 21 doesn't go the way you want it to go, what effect do you think that would have on any kind of discussion in 2021 about tenant protections?
Well, I think in the most immediate need, we're going to need state tenant protections first and foremost. Like 3088 is going to expire at the end of January. There's a short window there for the state legislature to act, and they're really going to need to extend something. I think it's going to need to both prevent people from being evicted and offer a more long-term solution than this consumer debt. Some sort of rule that's going to get rid of the debt and help out the landlords, some of the smaller landlords that might hurt from that, address it that way. But I think there's going to have to be state action in January on tenant protections, regardless of how Prop 21 turns out.
And it's important just to note with Prop 21, nothing changes overnight if Prop 21 passes. All Prop 21 does is say local jurisdictions will have more power at the local level to enact tenant protections, but it actually doesn't, no tenant protections magically happen overnight. It's just up to the local jurisdictions. You know, so the County of Los Angeles, we could amend our rent stabilization ordinance, but it took us about 2 years to get through the deliberations when we were first passing rent stabilization. It's very technical, legal policy. You have to draft ordinances. There's just a process involved. So even if Prop 21 passes, we wouldn't be able to do anything, at least in the first 6 months. I mean, we'd be have to deliberating, having votes, having the lawyers draft things. It just takes time. These are really complicated policies.
Yeah, two things about that is one is the legislature, the other is the executive in at all levels of government, city, county, state. We're still in an emergency, a declared emergency. If the dark winter that Biden is talking about is coming, then that emergency is going to be worse than it was when we first declared the emergency. And both the county, the city, and the governor, all three of those jurisdictions, can halt evictions under their emergency authority. There's just no doubt about that. And that may be necessary as a way, in some ways, to sort of counterbalance the political power of the apartment association. We saw in the way that AB 3088 evolved that the imbalance between the power, the relatively small minority of people who own property compared to the huge number of people who live in that property is just overwhelming. And we're beginning to see, I think, a lot more grassroots organizing among tenants and so on, and even some statewide activity. But right now, the ability of the legislature to withstand the lobbying and the money by the owners of residential real estate, I don't think they're going to get it done. So I think we may be sort of going back to the future to some extent, which is to keep people housed, because once people are on the street, as Molly said, a lot of damage is done in that process, and it's phenomenally more expensive and difficult to get people back into housing than it is to keep them where they are.
Got it. It's one question from Ivan, kind of along those lines, is what are some of the avenues of relief that can be created by the county or for people who do fall into the situation where they have these experiences where judgments, I'm assuming evictions, could appear on their record? So what recourse do tenants who are about to be evicted have?
I'll take this. This is a primary area of interest for me because it's something that my team is working on every day. This is definitely something that I believe there should be a legislative fix for. It's currently quite difficult for people to have the record of their eviction sealed if it is public. It's basically just a discretionary. You can ask the judge to seal it. Not really any guidelines, not really any requirement. It's totally up to the judge. And so a lot of judges decline to grant that relief. And, most people who didn't have access to an attorney, if the person has access to an attorney, the attorney most likely is going to negotiate a settlement that includes having the record sealed. But the folks that don't have an attorney, often they default or they lose a trial. They're not able to do that. And so I think, there's something that could be done at the state level vis-a-vis, the records remain sealed, or the, more guidelines that would make it easier for judges to seal records. There also could be something at the county level about, what landlords can do with that information. Potentially, there were laws passed last year having to do with a discrimination based on source of income. And I was very curious to see how those would play out this year. Obviously, this year has been a little bit different because of the pandemic. Not as many people being evicted, so not as many people looking for housing. But there are things that can be done at the local level to protect people from discrimination based on these various factors. So I think that's definitely something that's worth looking into. But personally, I would love a fix at the state level.
Got it. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to give you all a chance to kind of close out. And I guess the question I was going to ask, how can people, your average Angelenos, get involved in some of the things that we've been talking about for the last hour? And feel free to add in any closing thoughts while you answer that question as well. I don't know who wants to start.
I can start, and I'll just say, I think it's really important to tell elected officials that these issues matter. because this is not what local elected officials or state or federal elected officials get contacted by their constituents about. And it's really important. This is the first election where we sort of have seen the Democratic platform involve a housing platform. I mean, oftentimes presidential platforms didn't even mention housing, which is crazy. These issues, whether it's housing supply of affordable housing or tenant protections, right to counsel, all of these things we need people to raise with elected officials and say this is really important. And if you want to go one step further, get involved. There's a lot of great organizing efforts. Like Gary was saying, we're seeing amazing grassroots coalitions of tenants coming together, having tremendous impact. I mean, it was a very powerful experience for me to be part of the county passing rent stabilization and seeing the power of the folks in the room to really change the votes, which, people were not happy when my boss first said we wanted to do rent stabilization. It was not popular. We didn't think it was going to win. And it was the organizing and the testimony and the involvement of folks who just kept showing up over and over again to say how important it was and share their personal stories that swayed the votes. So organizing really matters. And like I said, there's lots of great coalitions doing great grassroots organizing that folks can participate in.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We saw that there was a huge impact on the city council and at the county and passing these protections during the pandemic. I was really pleasantly surprised at some of the protections that were passed, even though in my view, they didn't go far enough, but really seeing people coming out in force, giving public comment, contacting their representatives at the local level, and also at the state level for AB 38 to try to push for some of these protections. It's been a really amazing thing to witness during the pandemic. I also want to give a little plug, because I know there's probably a lot of attorneys on this call, since we're a legal organization and a lot of the people who are interested in public counsel's events are attorneys, is that, we don't have a right to counsel. And so there are going to be a lot of people evicted who need attorneys. So find a way, if you can plug in, I promise you that an unlawful detainer is something that you can learn about how to take on. And so I would love to see, a mass movement of attorneys wanting to help and represent tenants until we can get, a robust right to counsel in Los Angeles County. That's my dream.
I would just say that when you call, you can do this tomorrow if you're in the city of LA and you have a city council person. Call them and tell them, if you can't do anything positive, don't make things worse by sending the police in to bulldoze every encampment close to a freeway or within 500 feet of a shelter. If nothing else, because if they can't be there, they're going to be somewhere. And that somewhere is much more likely to be in a neighborhood where they're going to upset people even more. So if you can't do anything positive, don't make it worse.
Definitely agree with what everyone said. I think another easy thing is try to educate yourself on the protections that are in place and make sure that your friends and family know about them, and other folks in your network know about the protections that are in place. And I think the best way to do that is like Molly was saying, is connecting up with some of the grassroots groups that are doing tenant work. So you can sort of try to become your own expert and make sure your friends and family are protected. But the best way to do it is linking up with community groups that are doing this work and can support you.
And the one thing I should say, if you're not ready to join groups like the LA Tenants Unions or the other grassroots groups, you can also go to stayhousedla.org, stayhousedla.org. We have a bunch of Know Your Rights workshops that are led by attorneys. There is information there for anyone who's facing an eviction on how to get connected to an attorney, potentially financial assistance if needed. It's a great resource. We hope someday we have a right to counsel, but this is our first step in that direction, was the creation of stayhousedla.org. So it's a really good resource.
Here.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have David's going to come back on to close us out. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank all four of you for answering these great questions and educating people out there about what they can do. was going to say, does anybody have any closing thoughts while we're waiting for, oh, David, you are back. Never mind. Well,
Here I am.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all, Gary Blasey, Greg Bonnet, Molly Reisman, Silvana Naguib, and our moderator, Erica Smith, for your informed comments and insights, and really great discussion tonight. So many comments came in, just people were thanking you for your informed insights and your knowledge and your expertise. And thank you so much for a great conversation. Our next panel will take place on Tuesday, November 10th, where we'll further explore some possible solutions to the problems that we're raising tonight. Our panelists will include City Councilman Mike Bonin, Civil Rights Attorney Carol Sobel, and Public Counsel Supervising Attorney for Homelessness Prevention, Lorraine Lopez. Following that, on November 19th, we will explore the changing immigration law and practices in the United States with an amazing panel of experts and leaders. And we have a couple more sessions in December and beyond. For more information on the series, please go to hourofjustice.org. And for more information about how you can support Public Counsel's work through donations of time and treasure, please visit our website at publiccounsel.org. And I would add to the comments about all you attorneys out there, we love your pro bono work. And please sign up at publiccounsel.org. Thank you all again. And